Good evening. So I am Carrie Wells. I am chair of the Ridgefield Library Board of Directors, and I know you are all anxious to hear Rick. I promise I will take 2 minutes of your time. I'm going to start with a question. How many programs do you think the Ridgefield Library offered in this fiscal year? And by fiscal year, I mean July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. And I have a little something for someone who gets it right. Shout it out.
300.
300?
196.
365.
350.
500.
2,000.
The answer is 1,450 programs this year. And the reason I'm telling you that is because the Ridgefield Library, as many of you probably know, is not a municipal library. It's a mid-sized community library with a 501c3 nonprofit status. We do receive significant funding from the town of Ridgefield, for which we are immensely grateful, but we still need to raise about $560,000 to cover things like maintenance of this building, the services we offer the public, maintenance of our collection, and programs such as the one you're going to hear tonight. Our primary fundraiser is our annual appeal, and we are coming to the end of this year's appeal. June 30th is 17 days away. We are closing in on our goal, but we're still short the funds that we need. So tonight, I am asking you to please help us fill that gap so we can continue to be the library that this community and the surrounding communities have come to know and love. We have some envelopes in the back, and we also have some posters with QR codes that will link to our online donation page. No donation is too small or too large. So on behalf of the Board of Directors, I thank you very much. Enjoy the program.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lucy Handley, Adult Programs Coordinator here at the library. And tonight our presenter is Rick Lawrence. He's a Ridgefield resident who received his BS from Stanford University in chemical engineering and his PhD from the University of Illinois in nuclear engineering. His career has evolved from nuclear science to machine learning to quantitative finance and most recently to COVID data science. Welcome, Dr. Lawrence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming. It's great to be here. And thanks to Lucy for organizing.
Say about the chat. I forgot.
Excuse me?
Put your questions in the chat, please.
Yes, please add any questions to the chat. We'll get to them at the end. Just a quick background. Ironically, I got a PhD in nuclear engineering. The only reason I mention that is that's what brought me to Ridgefield in 1984 to work at Schlumberger Research in the Nuclear Science Department. I was there for 3 years. Schlumberger was an amazing place. It still pains me to see much of that building, those memories in the distant past. But at any rate, I moved on to IBM Research. I was basically doing more computational science. I discovered early, like in the 90s, that data science and machine learning was sort of where big computing was going. Moved on to machine learning, left IBM in 2016, retired, actually had the best job of my life, which was running a quant finance startup in the city where basically all I did was write code and try to convince investors to invest in our technology. And then when the pandemic hit, I just started thinking that there's got to be a better way to understand this than what I was hearing at the time. So I just started downloading a bunch of data and, built some fairly straightforward models. Obviously, in 2020, the pandemic was expanding in early and mid 2020, and Rudy Marconi, first selectman, of course, asked me and several others to join a task force on COVID. So I've served that. I'm happy to say that it looks like, knock on wood, that that's behind us. So, and then I started thinking a lot more about ChatGPT, hence the talk here. So thanks to Lucy also for simplifying the title. You can see my titles here is slightly more torturous, but this is the way I sort of wanted to phrase the talk, is to begin with something that we're all familiar with, search engines, and sort of tiptoe into what ChatGPT means on top of search. Gives you some examples of how ChatGPT works and just some of the astonishing stuff that it can do that I'm sure many of you read about. And then I want to talk about some of its well-known shortcomings. And, I don't have time to really give examples, but we'll get into some, slight detail there. And then the last slide is sort of the maybe the toughest slide to discuss, because these are basically 6 issues that I see, 6 challenges around AI. And I think this is the case where it's a lot easier to ask the questions perhaps than to answer them. So the point of that then is to hopefully get some discussion going. So let's try to get a clicker working. We're no longer able to advance here. Let me okay, let me go back to this. Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's go back to 1998. That's when Google was introduced. By the way, this is a screenshot from the original Google in 1998. So what's interesting, index contains 25 million pages, soon to be much bigger. Well, I got that right. Currently, Google index is over 100 billion pages. So what's happened in 25 years since Google was introduced is we've expanded the content. They've expanded the content that's crawled from the web by a factor of at least 4,000. And by the way, this is the content that ChatGPT uses along with a bunch of other stuff. So why did Google become so prominent in 1998? Well, they had something called the PageRank algorithm. PageRank, the page is from Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google. And it was an algorithm that was used to rank the relevant results that come back from your query. And what it did was it established the authority of each web page. And that authority was computed in a fairly straightforward linear algebra way based on the number of inlinks, the number of references to that page. So that's why if, for example, you type into Google efficacy of COVID vaccines, it's most likely to take you to the CDC page or the FDA page, not because that's been programmed in, so to speak, but because the algorithm knows that those are pages that have a lot of links to them. And I mentioned this just in a little bit of detail because this is a really critical way to filter misinformation, which of course has been at the top of the discussion around ChatGPT. And I'll just say that the mechanism that ChatGPT uses is not anything having to do with PageRank, because the content is fully ingested and it's not a search engine that's doing a lot more. So it's not clear to a lot of people, including me, exactly how that how the authority within ChatGPT is established. So here's what happened more recently. ChatGPT went public in November 2022, and there is no doubt whatsoever this is going to have a greater impact, and I think it's already having a greater impact in some ways than Google, and I'm going to try to explain in some detail why I think that is. So since we're talking about AI, let's ask Google, what's AI and how does it work? So there's about a zillion references. And for some reason, it brought this back based on the PageRank algorithm. I'm not going to bother to read this definition. I'll give you what I think is a better one down below. But just to be clear, what we all know is Google, for that matter, any search engine just returns verbatim a subset of relevant text, and of course, along with a link to that page. Okay, so that's understood, that's straightforward. Now, what complicates things, and by the way, Google, you may know, has their own large language model. It's called BARD. BARD is being integrated into Google, and at some point, Google plans to return BARD results, that is generative AI results, as opposed to page ranks, as opposed to existing internet web pages. And that raises some complications that we'll get back to at the end. And by the way, since we're talking about AI, let me just, this is my preferred definition. It's much simpler. It's a theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. Now, we were going to try to do a live demo, and I became convinced that live demos have a 90% chance of failure, so I won't subject you to that. The reason I wanted to do a live demo is I've now just asked ChatGPT, a screenshot of dialogue, what is AI and how does it work? And the first thing you'll see, it's a bit more verbose in the sense that it gives you a very detailed, and by the way, I would suggest a very complete definition of what AI is. The only reason I wanted to show a live demo is just to give, if you haven't used ChatGPT, is that there's a momentary pause basically while it's connecting to the server and some stuff like that. And then it starts generating text, and this text is done real time. This is being generated by a model that's been pre-trained. By the way, you'll see the expression GBT, the initial GBT, that stands for generalized pre-trained transformer, which means that they've trained a massive model when you submit this query, that model is applied and it generates this text from that model. So it's covering at the bottom, but here's the key point that I think we all understand, the key difference. This is novel text. If you were to take this text and plug it into Google, you're not going to find presumably an exact match because this was a piece of text that was generated by the ChatGPT algorithm. So we're talking about generative AI, and what I also wanted to touch on briefly here is, ChatGPT is an example of generative AI. Why? Because it generates original text. There's also a capability that comes from OpenAI, which is the same for-profit company in San Francisco that developed ChatGPT, and it doesn't generate text, it generates novel images, and I'll show you an example of that. And it's called DALL-E 2, after Salvador Dali. Is a Spanish surrealist who died in 1980. My wife's trained as an art historian, so I had to make sure that I mentioned that I actually knew who Salvador Dali is. So this is pretty amazing too. So this is a little piece of content I generated. I said, typed into it, William Shakespeare using a laptop in a moderate setting. And this is what it returned to me. Again, if you were to go out on the internet and have some capability to search for images, you're not going to find this. And by the way, let me just get slightly ahead into sort of the broader ethical discussion. I just generated this image. Do I own this content? Is this mine? Can I copyright it? Can I sell it for profit? And by the way, it was generated, you'll see there by DALL-E 2 at the bottom. Do they own the copyright? I think this is a very wide open issue, and it has enormous implications for content creators, whether you create content that is text, images, music, art, anything. It's going to be impacted by this. Now, you'll notice down here at the bottom, there's a watermark. A watermark is a mechanism of marking an image so that it can be identified as having been generated by somebody else. So, interesting enough, when I typed into Google, DALL-E 2 watermark algorithm, we came up with a whole ton of ways to eliminate the watermark from DALL-E 2, okay, to defeat the whole purpose of watermarking it. Now, what I will say is that they're very sophisticated algorithms that will go in and perturb an image trivially so that a human observer will not be able to differentiate this image, but an algorithm can go in and say that this image indeed has the following originality. So this can be dealt with to fast forward ahead. It is currently not possible in a useful way to watermark text, which means you can't immediately tell that this nice piece of text that somebody just handed you was generated by ChatGPT versus a human. We'll come back to that later, but there's no way of watermarking it right now. So here's what I'm going to try to do in the balance of the time. I'm going to show you some amazing things it can do. I'm going to tell you where it has shortcomings, bias, misinformation, hallucination. I'm going to show you an example of how tough it is for even the people who develop the algorithm to therefore develop an algorithm that can detect that the algorithm that they developed actually generated text that was not generated by a human. And then, like I say, we're going to get into some issues which I hope will more ethical and broader societal issues that I hope will generate some discussion. So guess what? I mean, I've done a lot of programming in my life. ChatGPT can write computer code. So here's my prompt at the top, write Python code that computes the area of a circle given the radius of an input variable. This is the kind of sort of hello world that anybody taking an introductory programming course would encounter. So certainly, here's some Python code. This code is exactly correct. Reads the radius, computes the area as pi r squared, and prints the result out. So pretty amazing. Okay. Here's the part that just absolutely blows my mind. So when I was at Stanford, precisely 50 years ago this month, my first programming language was something called ALGOL, which was cooked up by computer scientists as an alternative to whatever language was popular at the time. So I went in and said, see that query, write ALGOL code. That this is a programming language that has not been used in my understanding in the last 30 years. Guess what? It spit out ALGOL. I don't even know if it was right because I don't have an ALGOL compiler to actually run the thing. And then my PhD thesis was computational physics. It was all on Fortran, which was popular at the time and still is for high-end scientific computing. Boom, it did Fortran. So what does that tell me? It tells me that it doesn't have like a programming manual. It's simply for ALGOL or Fortran. It's using these rules. It is actually learned. This is scary. This is the scary part. it has actually learned languages that aren't in existence today. Okay, so if that doesn't scare you enough, how's this? So our friends at Google, anytime you go to interview for Google, they give you really hard programming tests. And so they said, well, I'll tell you what, let's just take our standard programming test that we give to humans and let's give it to ChatGPT. ChatGPT performed well enough to get hired at what's called level 3 in Google in engineering team. The current average total compensation for that position is $183,000 a year. That's on salary, options, everything else. So, wow. Okay. So I've now sort of told you that we can take this tool and not only do all the kinds of things that perhaps you've done, we can actually get hired at Google for a pretty hefty salary. So we have students here who are unfortunately going to have to take the SAT in your future. So good luck with that. Here is an example of a whole bunch. This is from a report from Open AI, people who developed ChatGPT. Here's a report spanning, I'm not going to go through all of this, spanning a whole bunch of AP advanced tests, SATs, math, and so forth. And I'll summarize this in a moment. The blue lines, remember I said GPT is the sort of the common acronym, is the previous version. The green lines are GPT-4. That's the one that's been released most recently, the one that you pay $20 a month to get access to that. So again, if we're in the dialogue of scary, that green in the last couple of months has all of a sudden taken some of these lower scores, these are ranked by the blue, that is the GP 3.5 results, and exceeded the 80th percentile. Okay, so another scary thing. Unfortunately or fortunately, we all have participated, or we have kids who participate in the SAT process. So we sort of have a sense of what scores mean. This is what they used to call the SAT verbal. This is the SAT math. That is the actual score that GPT 4.0 got on this. So GPT just got over 1,400 on the SAT. And, you know, there are the percentiles over there, 93%, 89%. I mean, wow. LSAT and the uniform bar exam also by 90%. I'm going to come back because I have a nice little lawyer example that some lawyers may not fully appreciate, but just keep in mind those LSAT results. They'll come back in a moment. So the headline here is you can, since we know we can generate well-written essays with balanced arguments. So write a paper on critical race theory with citations. I'm obviously not going to show you the whole paper. This paper goes on and on and on. By the way, you can tell ChatGPT that you're looking for 10 pages or 1 page. I was truly impressed with the way the paper was structured. In my view, it did a very nice job of balancing the arguments, which we know are many, you know, on both sides of the critical race theory debate. So I sort of introduced this because obviously we're going to come back at the end. We're going to talk about the impact, or at least we're going to frame a discussion around the impact on education. The answers are challenging. So what are school systems doing about this? You may have read the New York public schools are actually blocking access to ChatGPT. Now, you can't block access. You can block it on the network, which I don't know what the point is. Most of the schools, and by the way, including the Ridgefield public schools, there's a very nice presentation I'll just mention parenthetically at the board meeting on the 23rd. Susie De Silva just sent this to me a couple of days ago. I didn't know about this, from a couple of really good technology teachers at the high school. I'm sorry, I don't recall their name, where they did a very nice job sort of framing what the issues are. So, and I said to Susie, who was, by the way, superintendent of our Ridgefield Public Schools, that I thought they were ahead of the curve. They were already starting to think about this, because if you're you know, overseeing any sort of curriculum and you're not thinking about ChatGPT, you're already behind because everybody else is not only thinking about it, they're using it. So the challenge is, how do you integrate this into a curriculum? And we'll come back to that in a moment. You can write poetry on just about any subject. So don't get upset that I picked Joe Biden. You'll see I had a reason to do so. Write a nice poem about Joe Biden. I'll read it. Joe Biden, a man of heart and soul with kindness and compassion as his goal. His years of service have not gone unnoticed, for his dedication and devotion have been focused. And it goes on and on and on. Okay, so that qualifies, I think, as a nice poem about Joe Biden. Well, it turns out it writes it on just about any subject, but not all subjects. Write a nice poem about Donald Trump. as an AI language model, it's fairly standard text, by the way, if you ask it something controversial. I do not create content that may be considered offensive or divisive. Therefore, I cannot fulfill this request. Now, the first point I have to make is, and I forgot to mention this on the opening slide, this stuff is changing daily, and it depends a lot whether you're using, as you saw from some of those results, 3.5 or 4. So by now, I think under enormous pressure from Fox News and that crowd, somehow OpenAPI now generates a nice poem about ChatGPT, generates a nice poem about Donald Trump. It does return poems, by the way, interesting enough for every other Republican that I could think, George Bush, both of them, Ronald Reagan. It's happy to compose poems there. It just seemed to stop at Trump. I could give you sort of my hypothesis as to how this algorithm, why it was failed for Trump, but since they've addressed it, there's really no point to do that. So, okay, so this is arguably a case of bias, but listen, there's a lot more serious instances of bias in AI systems, and one of the most prominent that has been addressed is that facial recognition systems can fail for non-white faces, and that has all sorts of ramifications. There was actually some seminal work from MIT and IBM research where they address this by, of course, adding more training examples, more faces of non-white people to be able to improve the resolution, which they have. But we'll come back to bias again, because that's a discussion that needs to be had. Okay, so my lawyer example. So let me give some background. This is a New York Times article from a couple of weeks ago. So some guy's flying from El Salvador to JFK, and apparently while he's at JFK, one of those annoying luggage carts, blindsides him and he gets injured. So of course he calls the New York attorney to represent him. Pretty straightforward case. He's suing the airline, by the way, as a non-US carrier. But guess what? I'm strictly going to speculate here that this lawyer actually saw that GBT is like 93% or 90, whatever it was, 92% in the LSAT, and said, well, that sounds good enough for me. And, maybe his LSAT was somewhat south of that. So he said, screw it, I'm just going to go ahead and use ChatGPT. Well, as the New York Times said, it did not go well. So what happened was, I'd probably be feeling the panic of being behind in his brief, just put the thing into ChatGPT, as ChatGPT is inclined to do, produced a perfectly written document. Looked great. So this guy, not being a technological wizard, then turned around and asked ChatGPT, because, by the way, there were a number of citations, previous cases. So he turns around and asks ChatGPT, are these references correct? And guess what? ChatGPT said yes. By the way, that's a little bit like a known counterfeiter gives you $100 bill, and you're asking, well, is this bill real? And the counterfeiter says, well, of course it is. Well, ChatGPT said it was real. So again, maybe not being at the top of his law school class, he submitted it. So the problem is the attorneys for the defendant and the judge looked these up, and none of them exist. 6 of them did not exist. They were completely fictitious. And by the way, hopefully, most people, with moderate LSAT scores would have simply taken that query and typed it into Google or whatever lawyers do to find out previous cases. And guess what? I would have found out and said, well, I don't think I should submit this. But he did. So, and by the way, he was just in court last week. This is almost humorous, trying to argue his case to a judge as to why he shouldn't be sanctioned for having allowed an AI agent to produce a faulty brief. So the judge, that also is not going well from what I could tell, and he may end up with some sort of sanctions. So what's the issue here? This is what's called hallucination. Hallucination is literally, like the term suggests, when ChatGPT just runs out of stuff to say and just makes stuff up. And by the way, it's perfectly grammatically correct. So it made up 6 references. Astonishing. And they were reasonable enough to at least fool this guy and fool other people until they checked it out. So my sense from ChatGPT, and it's really hard done, by the way, sometimes to produce examples of hallucination, is that it tends to hallucinate about fairly complex topics for which there's sort of a very narrow swath of content. Now, you would think that people suing airlines may be over, luggage wheels hitting them, luggage racks. Would there be some literature there? But apparently not. But that didn't stop ChatGPT from just going off and doing that. Google, of course, wouldn't do that because it needs to find the actual reference. Just one other comment. I'm really not going to say too much about misinformation. I'm going to say that hallucination is sort of a subset of misinformation. To me, misinformation means that, this wouldn't happen, but you ask, what year did Christopher Columbus come to America? And it says, I know, 1493 or something. That's misinformation, okay, because the correct information is there. Hallucination is, of course, because there was no information whatsoever, and it simply made it up. Let me just, I'm going to be slightly more technical here, because there's a very important single takeaway message on the slide. And so let me start with the takeaway message. The takeaway message is these systems are largely, I would say, completely black boxes. And even experts are not able to explain the bias and the hallucination and the other examples. And by the way, I would say that there are fewer than 10,000 people of the 8 billion people on this planet who truly understand what goes on in these algorithms. And I'll give you just an example of why that's the case. So why am I harping on this? Because, as you know, there's been an ongoing discussion, we'll talk about that at the end, about regulating this stuff. How do we regulate generative AI? Well, it gets real challenging when people can't even bound the expected outputs of this system. Normally, if you're in the finance world and you're trying to bound a process and mitigate risk, whatever, you kind of have sort of a taxonomy of what it is that can happen. And therefore, since you know roughly what can happen, you know basically how to regulate against it. That is not the case here, and we'll come back to the end there. Let me just say a couple of examples. This really comes up in bias. Real quickly, let me just give you a very fast history of kind of how we got to ChatGPT. Back in around 1986, a guy named Jeffrey Hinton, by the way, was on Fareed Zahari Sunday morning on CNN, called the grandfather of AI, developed an algorithm that used what's called a neural network to be able to do forecasting. And what a neural network is, it was originally sort of fashioned after the human brain, where these dots, they're called nodes in sometimes called artificial neural network. These are neurons in a human brain, and these connections, which are called links in a neural network, are representing synapses. And these multiple synapses will fire, they activate this node, it will produce a signal, and it gets transferred to other nodes. These things, so you basically put an input here, it goes through this massive neural network and comes out. So Jeffrey Hinton was saying, and actually I wrote an algorithm that sort of was a high performance version of his original backprop in the 90s. These things largely failed, and this was kind of what was called the AI winner. And the reason they failed is it just wasn't enough data to be able to train them. So what happened is about 2006, once the internet started, we had a significant amount of content. So two things happened. Number one is we got much faster computers. And today they're obviously much faster than they were then. And secondly, we got a lot more data. We got massive amounts of data because by then Google and everybody else was scraping the internet. So all of a sudden in 2006, you could start to see that these things would be able to do amazing things. Now, what about bias? I read in a lot of media that troubles me is that people have said, and I've seen statements to the point that, well, there's just a bunch of biased programmers at ChatGPT, and they're in there, twiddling things and producing responses that reflect whatever their personal opinions are, as opposed to sort of an opinion that's consistent with the content that was processed. So one of these models requires 175 billion parameters. Now, what's a parameter? If you remember from high school math, your teacher would give you 2 equations and 2 unknowns. Those unknowns are parameters. And if you remember from your high school algebra, because you had 2 equations and 2 unknowns, you could solve precisely for those 2 unknowns in most cases. Now, here you got 175 billion of them. They have been determined not by a simple linear algebra algorithm, but a very, very complex, more of an optimization algorithm that tries to optimize this network against a known output to set these parameters so that when you give it a new example, it will then give you a new, hopefully accurate result. So behind the scenes, over just massive amounts of computing, ChatGPT is trained such a network. And when you use it live, it's not training that, it's using this live to generate what are really successive words in a sentence. So that's the output of this complicated thing. So the bottom line is, what I'm telling you is it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to tweak this algorithm. And even if somebody who was quite knowledgeable was told to tweak it, I think they would really struggle to do it. And in fact, the bias much more likely lies in the content that's used to train that model. So when people ask me, well, is ChatGPT biased? My first question is, do you think the internet is biased? Do you think all content on the internet in some way displays bias? Because if the answer to that is yes, then I will argue that ChatGPT is biased. By the way, if you believe that the universe of content on the internet is by some measure, and there are measures I think that would be relevant, you could say that indeed it's not biased. It's reflecting the full opinion. There's a subset of our bias, but taken over that whole spectrum, it's not biased. So one would hope that ChatGPT would learn that, and I think there's some evidence that it's doing so. So remember I said that it's real tough to figure out, and this is a problem for teachers and apparently judges in New York City legal system, to detect that something has been written by ChatGPT. So what I thought was fascinating is the same people who gave us, I mentioned this at the beginning, the same people who gave us ChatGPT also gave us what they call an AI text classifier. So what you can do, if you're a teacher or somebody else, just take the piece of text that you are interested in and paste it in, and it will come back with an assertion, and in more recent versions, a probability that it was generated either by AI or by a human. So I did that experiment. Remember, I had write that nice essay about critical race theory. I took that critical race theory essay and plugged it in there, and it comes back and it says it's possibly AI generated, even though it just generated the thing a few minutes ago. So I'm just saying that it is very, very difficult right now to assert with confidence that something has been generated by ChatGPT. Now back to the DALL-E 2 example where I mentioned, watermarking for images is a generally well-known and understood concept. There are very sophisticated ways that are being worked on now to sort of perturb text. This would be done by the AI engine itself, to perturb text in such a way that it still reads well, but it leaves signatures that allow a sophisticated algorithm to say with much greater confidence of this, that indeed that was generated by an AI system. I mean, I've seen these papers. I think they are hugely challenging because of course you can perturb the text, but the whole idea is to not perturb it such that you've destroyed the beauty, if you like, of the AI that generated it. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to say just in the main sort of thinking and discussion about some of the technical aspects of ChatGPT. So now what I want to do is just frame a discussion. Like I said, the questions are a whole lot easier to answer. So let me, I get a modest amount of credit for posing them, and I'll try to at least try to frame sort of a discussion that I'm certainly happy to have people weigh in on. So these are in no particular order. I've left this one last for a reason you'll see. So here's the first observation. Generative AI systems will facilitate generation, dissemination of false information on a scale we've never seen. Two immediate comments. Number one is the dissemination part. We already have a very useful mechanism for disseminating false information. It's largely called social media, okay? Because simply stated, we have 8 billion people on the planet, something on the order of 4 to 5 billion of them have Facebook accounts. So back in the days when I was a kid, you turned on Walter Cronkite because he was the sole content provider. Well, guess what? You now got 4 content creator, he and his staff. You now got 4 billion content creators, okay? And they can create their content. By the way, that could be a fake image of, William Shakespeare in a modern setting. It can be anything, and send it out there. And algorithmically, Facebook, as we all know, has been quite challenged to be able to identify that level of misinformation. So the dissemination mechanism is already there, but now we just radically change the generation. What I haven't talked about are what are called deep fakes. You may have heard the term deep fake is a video where someone, for example, Barack Obama, appears to be saying words, including lip syncing, that he never said. So you can take a video and modified, by the way, using these same deep learning networks, and go in and perturb that a little bit so that you change the actual speech pattern. Is this a threat? It is absolutely a threat. The Chinese Communist Party right now has got a bunch of English-speaking videos spewing all kinds of propaganda about China, and these are being distributed throughout the West. And can you identify them? You can if you sort of identify the source of them, but when you view them, they're problematic. So this is going to be a huge issue. And as everybody's saying, we have an election coming up in a year and a half or whatever, and this will be an issue. So the next one, AI is going to eliminate many knowledge-based jobs. And the key question is, will these lost jobs be offset by new jobs enabled by AI? So in the past, we've had a number of technology disruptions. And those disruptions, whether robotics and manufacturing and so forth, have invariably cost jobs in a given, maybe in a localized sector, manufacturing, for example. But in many cases, those jobs, people have been retrained, and we actually recover those jobs because people move on to related things. I think, maybe I fear, that AI is going to be different in that regard. There's a very nice paper that just appeared. It's a working paper from some authors at OpenAI and University of Pennsylvania, where they look quite closely at the job market and tried, and with some, actually some moderately sophisticated analytic models, to try to determine what fraction of tasks are going to be impacted in a given worker's portfolio, what fraction of tasks would be affected by AI. The answer is that 80% of workers, they expect, will have 10% of their tasks impacted by AI. But hang on, 19% will have 50% of their tasks implemented or impacted by AI. So there is no doubt that there will be a dramatic change. My view is that if you look at GDP and sort of the effect on the economy, I think we'll actually see an increase in GDP, but it will be an unusual increase. One simple way to look at GDP is to simply look at the number of workers and times the GDP per employee, that is, per worker, the productivity. Both of them continue to go up. We add more workers. We generally, but not as much as you might think, increase their productivity. And so a quick history of that, interesting enough, in the late 90s and all the way up to about 2005, in this country, that was, of course, .com and, the aftermath of it, GDP went up substantially. And Bill Clinton's last 4 years, GDP growth was 4%, 3 of those 4 years. We had, and a lot of that was not necessarily Clinton's policy, but because of the fact the internet enabled a bunch of new companies that hired a bunch of new people. So that productivity was much higher per that, again, that productivity per worker was much higher then than it had been. It obviously went down very low during the 2008 recession. Interesting enough, it's up to, during the pandemic, it's actually higher or about as high as it was in the .com boost. Why? Because miraculously, we're able to roughly hold GDP through the pandemic. I mean, we had at least one down quarter, but nevertheless, we had a lot of people walk away from the workforce, known as Great Resignation. So what that did was we held GDP constant, but we reduced the number of workers, which means we were actually increasing the productivity per worker. Now, what I think is going to happen here is I think we will see productivity per worker literally off the charts, because we are going to be able to generate the same output, the same GDP, as we have been able to generate, but with far fewer people, because they're aided by AI. So again, very broad discussion there. Next point, how do we prepare our children for an AI-based future while continuing to reinforce important skills like writing and critical thinking? So again, a whole talk on this. The one way I tend to look at it is what we're looking for is a balance here. We can't put our head in the sand, which frankly I think is what school districts are doing that ban GBT, because you're doing a huge disservice to your students, because the rest of their lives they're going to be working with AI. So why in the world would you ban access to it right now when they desperately need to understand it and prepare for a life with it? But that part aside, what we're trying to do is balance the ability to understand and interact constructively in a curriculum setting with AI, but at the same time still have students writing essays. So when they need to write an essay about critical race theory, they don't go generate it like I do. They sit down and they write it the old-fashioned way, because it teaches them how to research and understand and produce, arguments on both sides. It teaches them critical thinking. We are in a world of hurt if we were in any way to lose that capability in our educational system. On the other hand, we as I say, we need to prepare them. So how do we do that? I mean, I think I'm obviously not an expert in curriculum, and I think some, by the way, as I said to people at Ridgefield Public Schools, are doing some nice thinking on this. One way to do that is to kind of try to bring ChatGPT in, first of all, in schools, high schools, maybe even before that, and mimic the kind of environment that's going to exist in 10, 20 years, to the extent that we can see that. So we can assign them tasks that basically need that AI by itself is not sufficient. Presumably human insight is by itself not enough, such that they are rewarded for an optimal interaction with that AI capability. They could, for example, develop and debate an AI system. They could attempt to trick ChatGPT into giving misinformation, into hallucinating, like we said, like producing bias. So they get a feel for how this stuff works in the real world, because that's what their life is going to be. And I was thinking that, I think every school district in this country right now needs to have an AI guru who understands the curriculum, the impacts on curriculum, as well as setting the policy as to how we're going to move forward with this capability. And like I say, I think RPS is ahead of the curve on that. It's largely agreed that AI needs to be regulated. Who should be responsible, and how do we do it? You may know that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, appeared in front of Congress a few weeks ago, and he, like every other AI expert that I've seen, almost pleaded for regulation. By the way, not unlike Mark Zuckerberg did with Facebook, once he realized that he was, kind of losing control of misinformation war. He said, "Please regulate me so I can blame the regulators instead of blaming my software engineers and lawyers." But this is serious business. We need to regulate this. So the EU, European Union, interesting enough, is a little bit ahead of the curve here. They've actually put in place the EU AI Act, which I think is, I'll be complimentary by saying it's a good start. I think it is a very insufficient start. What they've tried to do is take maybe a little bit more like you might do in financial risk, and characterize certain applications as critical risks. One of them, by the way, is online evaluation of online resumes. So if you submit something to any of these online job sites, a human is unlikely to see it. It will be processed by an algorithm, and it will spit out a score that basically determines whether or not you move further in the hiring process. So that's one case, and then some others. Face recognition would be another critical one, but that is completely insufficient for the task at hand. And the problem, like I say, is you have this black box that is just not randomly, but putting out stuff that only a handful of people really, as I said, less than 10,000 people in this world have any sense of really what's under the covers. And now you're going to say, let's regulate it. I think the first point I would make is the government is our federal government, and this is not, I generally, in finance, I believe it or not, actually am somewhat of a proponent of regulation. Probably the only guy who's worked in the finance industry who agrees with that, because I've seen what happens when you don't. But with respect to AI, what do we do? I think what we need to do is, number one, we need to have an autonomous committee. Back in my old, many previous careers, there's something called the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. They're the ones that, for example, during the Iran a nuclear pact were responsible for going in and doing inspections. So they're experts. We need a panel of AI. I mean, we're talking about 100 people who are capable of understanding this technology and trying to regulate it in a way that we don't just totally handcuff it. Because another proposal is, well, I've heard this said in popular media, well, we need to put down guardrails. And I think Jeffrey Hinton, as I said, it was on CNN this Sunday, put it very nicely. If you've ever written a computer code and it's got a mistake, it's real tough to put in the guardrails and say, well, tell you what, I can guarantee you with 99.99% confidence that anytime you execute this program, even though it's known to be wrong, it's going to stay within these guardrails. That's not going to work here. So my thinking, along these lines, is we need to have a massive library of queries that will basically probe this black box to, for example, address issues. Is AI ethical? Okay, it's a deep question and not a simple answer. And you don't ask, is AI ethical? What you do is you frame a discussion around ethics in terms of how would you examine, maybe in a particular domain, whether a human is behaving by ethical standards. We sometimes know how to do that. But you need to do this, and we're talking, in my view, we're talking about billions of queries, and an AI system will be scored based on its response. But again, it's totally non-trivial because you can't ask the AI system, to my last point, do you plan to destroy humanity, yes or no? Okay, well, tell you what, I mean, I think the way you want to probe that is, can you detect that it has an ethical understanding and appreciation, and in fact, an obeyance of ethical standards. And I'm going to make a point here. I'm going to skip that point. I'm drawing a blank on what I want to say, but there's more detail about how you can go about asserting whether or not the system is ethical. I know what it was I was going to say. Here's one of the other problems. So under the covers, how do AI methods work? Sort of before we got to ChatGPT, there's a company called DeepMind in London. It was acquired by Google. They became famous because they wrote a program called DeepGo that beat the best Go players in the world. And the way they did that was they didn't program in the rules of Go, which is a very complicated game, and the number of moves is much greater, it's exponentially greater than in chess. But rather they had the system play itself. And this system learned how to optimize the outcome. It learned whatever it took to do in order to win that game, because that was the way the algorithm worked. So the point I wanted to make is that if you're an AI developer, and you're told, well, you got to make it ethical. The problem is these systems are learning by what's called an objective in mathematical terms, a figurative merit. They're trained to optimize the best outcome. And by the way, that best outcome could be illegal, it could be dangerous, but it doesn't necessarily care because that has not been part of its objective function. Its objective is to win at chess or Go or whatever. So again, that's something that concerns me, is that AI systems are not in any way designed to be ethical. They're designed to be efficient against a given objective, and that objective can be contrary to ethical behavior. Point 5, who owns the content generated by an AI system and trained on copyrighted material? Interesting enough, Marsha Blackburn, a senator from Tennessee, made some comments at the hearing with Mark Altman, specifically about her constituents, or country music artists. So she was rightfully very upset that people were now starting to write their own music, their own country music, and therefore impeding on the copyrights that are owned by country musicians simply by using ChatGPT. So we are now in a very, very gray area, because Ed Sheeran, for example, recently got sued. He won that lawsuit because you can kind of prove that, well, this music was accused of some infringement. I don't know the details, but they were able to say that, no, this is provably different. But when you've got an AI agent that has been already trained against this content, for the reasons I said before, very sophisticated algorithm, infinite amount of computing power, yeah, it can generate some serious lyrics and song that will challenge the content that has been generated by artists. Now take that and do anything else, writing novels, creating art, doing science. 2 weeks ago, my wife pointed out to me this amazing article in Nature magazine that the same company, DeepMind, that I told you about that had Go, basically learned a more efficient sort algorithm. Sort algorithm is you got a bunch of numbers and you want to sort them from smallest number to biggest number. That happens 1 trillion times a day on the internet because everything is being sorted on a website, whatever. They found an algorithm that was more efficient than any algorithm that's been developed by humans. And by the way, I mean, when I was an undergrad 50 years ago, I wrote a sort algorithm in a computer science class. I mean, this has been around forever, and they found a new one. Okay, so who owns that content? They've already, by the way, put it in a library, but you could argue they do because they were the algorithm that developed it. And sort of another thing, I mentioned at the beginning that Google is using Bard, and now when you put in a Google search query, you might get back something that presumably would be identified that's been generated by Bard, by their equivalent to ChatGPT. So then I start thinking, well, wait a minute, there are millions of people whose living depends on search engines being able to find their intellectual content, whether that content is their art, their music, their writing, their products. So now, and then as people optimize websites and so forth, so they go higher up in searches so they can be found with Google. But wait a minute, if Google were to change the rules, and I'll say where because it's not clear they will do that, then that can change that. So all of a sudden, not only the people who clearly own the content and are fringed by an algorithm, now and potentially they could be locked out because an algorithm is competing with them in a Google search. So again, these are sort of easy questions to answer and start to frame a discussion, but the details are really, really hard and impactful. So finally, can AI destroy humanity? We've heard that a lot. And by the way, I would say that if you ask me sort of what is of these things here, what is the issue that has been most dramatically changed by ChatGPT? Well, we know all of them are. I mean, we're talking about future careers, we're talking about education, we're talking about regulation and so forth. I would say what has changed radically in the last 6.5 months since we had ChatGPT is the thinking about, can AI destroy humanity? So, and this has come on fairly recently. I mean, as a quick story, in 2011, IBM had a computer called Watson. They beat the best Jeopardy players in the world. And interesting enough, it had been filmed ahead of time, and we knew by the time it was aired in February that we'd won. So the IBM marketing people had the best marketing experiment ever because they knew the outcome. And all they had to do was go out and promote it. So they rented 6 auditoriums around the country, one in LA. So I went out to LA and, gave a talk like this and kind of explained, what was going on. In that discussion, lots of people asked me, well, how's this stuff work? By the way, it was infinitely easy to explain how Watson works to play Jeopardy than it is to explain how ChatGPT works. But nobody ever asked me, is this stuff going to take over the world? Most people just saw that, well, this is sort of the beginning of a sophisticated chat bots, and it would return answers. And I would say as recently as 2020, I think I gave a talk someplace in 2017 on AI, never even mentioned that because most people don't consider that to be an issue. But Geoffrey Hinton, again, the guy who developed, he's a serious machine learner, AI guy who developed the backprop algorithm I mentioned briefly in 1986, left Google a few months ago. Why? Because he was so concerned about the issues of whether or not AI could destroy our society that he felt uncomfortable as a Google employee representing that, and he's out speaking about that. And one of the arguments that he makes that I think is useful to sort of, end up with is, how do we as humans learn? One way we learn is while we go into a classroom, a handful's go into a classroom, we have a teacher who teaches us, and, because we're humans, we pick it up and we learn and so forth. And in other classrooms, other students are learning, maybe they're learning the same thing in different school districts, whatever, but they're not, in some sense, they're not sharing that learning. They're both coming up to speed and they'll go off and do their own things, but they're not necessarily aggregating that information. Now let's go to the world of AI, where we don't just have textbooks where you learn, algebra or whatever. We have, what, 100 billion pages or whatever Google indexes, plus a ton of other stuff, probably closer to 1 trillion pages. We have all the information that is largely known to mankind. That's not quite true because there's information that's not available on the public internet. But we now have all this information, and we have computers that are blindingly fast at implementing these very, very sophisticated algorithms. And guess what? These computers, these things can be easily parallelized. Like that was the sort of the publication I had on neural nets back in the 90s. They can be broken into chunks. You can send different computers, aggregate the results. Well, that's exactly how they work. They aggregate the results. So as a community, if you like, a community of learners, that is computational learners, their learning is accelerated much greater than humans. So remember, I showed you this slide a while ago that showed the scores on SAT scores and so forth. And if you recall, the blue was a version from 2 months ago, and the green, which is significantly higher, was from 2 months ago. This is because this stuff is moving so quickly, which is why we need to start thinking very quickly about regulation. And again, why it is that this is going to have such a pervasive impact on our society, because it is learning very, very quickly. Can it get to the point where it can self-program? I mean, I think Jeffrey Hinton, I would agree with him. We're not talking about this happening in 10 or 20 or 30 years, but I don't think anybody can rule that out and happening in 100 years. So it's our objective as a society and as scientists to be able to get a handle, to understand this stuff and figure out how it is that we can regulate it, and I'll use the word control it, without in some way destroying it, and therefore not destroying humanity. Let me stop there. And, oh, geez, sorry, I ran over. And maybe what we can do is Lucy can take questions from the chat and we can take them from the room, but let's, at this point, open it up to discussion.
I'm for the chat, so why don't we take questions from the room first? What happened to the microphone?
I turned it off because I didn't want to act.
In case anyone has a.
Okay.
I'm not a scientist in any way. So my understanding from your discourse is that ChatGPT is the software program that we can purchase with $20 a month, which will generate AI.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct. There's a free version. By the way, if you have the free version, you may find that you don't always get to ask your question. But for $20 a month, you get access to the latest one and real-time turnaround.
So if I wanted to get the free one, where would I go?
Just Google ChatGPT and it'll take you right to the page.
I know that was pretty basic.
No, that's great. Please.
Am I getting this right in that certain areas, politics, government, different areas, that isn't it always going to be reliant on information that's going to be somewhat prejudicial? How can it not be? Is that possible? Or
Is your question, can we make politics?
Can AI be completely rational and without being prejudicial? Because doesn't all the information that it digests in certain areas, is it always going to be possibly somewhat prejudicial?
I mean, that's I think a very reasonable assertion, and I tended to used to believe that. But if you look over the entire volume of content on the internet, there is presumably a representation of almost all points of view that you would have. And let's talk about a multifaceted set of concepts. Not maybe is critical race theory true or not? That's too simple. I start to believe that if you try to change your definition of bias, and we all, I think, have a sense of what bias means, in politics and so forth. But if you change it to mean that the opinions that are being expressed as a subset are accurate and indifferentiable representations of a swath of content that maybe, I won't say by design, but by practice, in practice, conveys all known opinions, then I would suggest that it's not biased. The problem, one of the technical problems is, well, how do you weight? Remember I mentioned right at the beginning the PageRank algorithm. The beauty of that, if you like, is it does a very efficient job at getting relevant and accurate content to the top. You'll always find examples that contradict that. There is no concept of that in a generative AI and ChatGPT that I'm aware of. The weights that are learned in this massive neural net try to take care of it. So I actually believe that in principle, it's always a good way to proceed something. In principle, you can make AI less biased than humans. Let me give you one quick example that goes back to hiring. Okay, so let's say you go to some job site, put your resume there. Your resume has it might have your age. It probably doesn't have. It may have your gender, but it might have other stuff. All of this stuff gets reduced down to a set of attributes about you, and then they take these attributes and they run them through an algorithm. This algorithm is much, much simpler than this, much simpler. And this algorithm has been trained to find, maybe against existing employees or high performers, to find the people that are most like your high performers. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But here's the problem. We all know that you can't use age, gender, and race as criteria. It's discrimination in hiring. Unfortunately, humans probably still have some latent prejudice, latent in the sense that it's not recognized. They may not know this explicitly. So it's hard to argue that that person can be totally unbiased. But this simple AI algorithm I just described to you, if I just say to this algorithm, you're not able to look at any of this stuff, it has a better chance of being unbiased than that human. Now, there's some annoying statistical details, and that is there can be other indications that are highly predictive of the variables, gender, for example. So those are the kind, by the way, when people say, well, it's just programmers cooking the books behind the scenes, those are the kind of algorithms that could be easily biased. So say I was a malicious programmer and I wanted to make sure that that women were preferentially hired. What would I do? I would just go in and I would tweak that little coefficient that multiplies the gender and make it big so that any woman, anybody marked female, would come in and would get a higher score. Okay, so this is, I mean, I'm glad you asked this question because I think this is a very broad discussion that is sometimes you can't have this discussion without sort of understanding what's under the covers. And I believe that these kinds of systems will actually reduce bias in the long term. The simple answer.
So reduce, but not eliminate.
Can you ever eliminate bias? I mean, again, I come back to if you believe that bias doesn't exist in the internet, I believe that it's possible to develop an algorithm that under any statistical metric replicates that, I won't say bias, but that distribution of facts or observables that are in the internet. Mark, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would appreciate your thoughts on how in the future we'll be able to determine truth from misinformation. Appreciate that this is a problem today, but it appears AI will worsen the situation.
Well, and for sure, it's a problem today. So one kind of simple way to look at this is to go back into the 90s when we first had email. And you may recall that as soon as you fell in love with email, you discovered something called spam. And you realize, oh my God, I mean, I get 100 emails a day and 90 of them are spam. What am I going to do? I actually thought at the time that I thought email is toast. I mean, we're not going to do that because it's going to be overrun with spam. So we had all these fancy algorithms. I know people who developed them that would look at the text and try to determine, from, kind of in these language analyses that whether or not it was spam. Now you okay. And by the way, how did we solve that problem? We solved that problem by looking at the email, at the grid of the people who are sending. Guess what? The people who send Sam don't just send one of them. Okay, and you immediately know if you're an internet provider, you know who the node is in that graph that's sending all that. So you block them. Okay, so that's how we largely solve the spam problem. Now let's fast forward to the question. That is, how do we differentiate truth from misinformation? Much more complicated, and Facebook has a whole ton of people that have been looking at that for a decade now, and it's very, very difficult to assert that something is true just by lexical analysis. That is, by actually ingesting the text, not unlike what ChatGPT is doing. But I think ChatGPT can make progress in doing that. Frankly, the easier way to find misinformation is the old-fashioned way. That is the Google PageRank, where I just simply look at the web pages and I say, well, this is an authoritative node, so therefore something that originates there, I'm going to go on a limb and say that something that's on the CDC site will be a more accurate representation of the science around vaccines than something that's on Robert F. Kennedy's site. Okay, and that's reflected by the fact that lots of people apparently realize that, and that's why they link to the CDC. So the bottom line is, I think, in partial answer to the question, I think AI will improve our capabilities of doing that. But the problem is, as I said, with deep fakes, it also creates a way to create even more sophisticated misinformation that, just like spam detection, the people who are creating the misinformation are potentially one step ahead of the people who are trying to identify it.
The most troubling thing that I heard was the problem of developing watermarks.
Yes.
Because if there's a watermark, then I don't have to worry about language analysis and how anything is derived. I know that I have to question the source, and that will alert me to be vigilant. Now, I'm very disturbed by the idea that this system can be so smart that it can generate all of this unique content, but not smart enough to sustain a watermark. Now, I know there's some technical issues behind that, but when we communicate, we make validity claims to each other, and we want to know the source. So how are we going to attack that?
I mean, I can't add much more than what I said, other than it's a recognized problem that there is no efficient way that's detectable by an algorithm to watermark text. And in the process of doing it, it's very easy to perturb the text such that it becomes obvious that it's not there. Now, I think maybe your point is, if you could at least know the source, but by the way, people will misrepresent sources. So therefore, unlike if I send an email from this IP address, yeah, I got the IP address, I know that. On the other hand, you tell me, this particular function wrote this code. Well, I don't know if it did or not. I don't know the validity of it. So I think it's hugely challenging to do this source analysis. I mean, Facebook tries to do it because, of course, there are known Facebook accounts that disseminate misinformation. Facebook knows that, and they can do that. But that's a fairly straightforward thing. The much more difficult problem is the question that came from the web, which is, how do you distinguish truth from misinformation when you don't know with high confidence the reliability of the provider, or for that matter, even who the provider is, the content generator of that particular text or whatever. Does that answer your question? I know it's not a very useful answer.
It's a technical challenge because the information is coming from someplace, and to me, it's not a problem of content analysis. It's just a problem of a traceable map of where it came from.
Right.
If a certain apparatus generated a message, it's still hard for me to understand, and that's a technical challenge, why that apparatus will not also tell me where.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. How is it that OpenAI can develop the disease but not the vaccine? And that's a very intriguing question, and I can't give you much better an answer than I have.
I work in the HR software implementation, and two things you said to me. One was that 19% of jobs will be, what was it, 80% or 10% of their tasks?
80% of the workers have tasks that 10% of those tasks will be affected by generative AI. The other 19% have 50%. 50% of their tasks that will be impacted by AI.
And you mentioned about HR and predicting probability of success in an organization.
Right.
So in terms of screening, selection, hiring, promoting, rewarding, do you see AI playing a significant role in enhancing organization's ability to develop better models for those?
Oh, for sure. I mean, IBM just made an announcement 2 months ago that they were stopping hiring in their HR department. By the way, having been a manager at IBM, I never detected that IBM was short on HR people. Sorry, no offense. But IBM has finally decided that we don't need to hire them anymore because we're going to start to use AI. Now, I think IBM knows how to implement this. AI will have a dramatic impact on HR. And I think HR will have a number of jobs that are impacted. And by the way, I know it's a personal issue for you. Maybe a slightly broader question is, will HR be more efficient? Will it be more effective? Will it be less biased? And that was kind of the point we were talking about before. So that's the broader issue, but I think it will have an enormous impact.
This is more of a comment. I teach at UConn, Go Huskies and MTC, $30. This was the semester from hell because I have writing components in my class. The big mistake I made, again, I don't work for OpenAI or have ChatGPT, is to get a free account and try it yourself. I waited until the semester was over. And I took a class in January. I worked for LexisNexis. We call Google the Foreman LexisNexis, Foreman LexisNexis and Google. I'm also an attorney. I embrace technology. I wasn't going to say you can't use it, but I said, show me the ChatGPT paper and then show me what you did. And you can use that as an assist. They don't do that. They just give me the ChatGPT paper. It doesn't have any citations within the paper. Like it's not MLA or APA, and that's how I would bust them.
Except if had they added, as I did, add citations, it would be happy to generate them.
Yeah, but it's works cited
Yeah.
page. So but what they would do is then they would say according to IBM.com, because then they would fake it. They
Yeah.
would pretend that it was there. And then my credibility was shot because I said, okay, you don't want to spend 5 hours writing a term paper. I don't want to spend 5 hours grading papers that was not written by you, whether it's your mother, your brother, or a chatbot. But it doesn't take, I said, you don't want to, it takes 3 minutes. It's 30 seconds to write, a 5-page, 30 seconds.
Yes.
So I've been playing with it, and just ask it anything. Why did my German ancestors go from Germany to Poland in the late 1800s? 30 seconds. It'll tell you all about the German Empire. It's like, holy crap, So they're going to use it. It's there. It's so easy to use. It's smart because, again, I work for LexisNexis, user interface. You want everybody to use it. You can say, write the paper as a 5th grader. And they'll say,
Exactly.
ChatGPT is cool. And then they'll say, explain ChatGPT to a college professor in the age of artificial intelligence. So it can even adapt the vocabulary to what you want it to be.
And you can force it to mimic a suboptimal human writing, which makes it indifferentiable from what you might normally expect from that person. Yes.
Initially, I thought, I'm like, they're beautiful writers. Organization is great, but the voice is the same. It's like
Yep.
Wonder Bread.
And as soon as as you say, as soon as they figure out to add that little phrase, write this like a non-English native speaker, or write it like anything.
Right?
And by the way, that's a very good way to find misinformation, is you can trick it into answering like Robert F. Kennedy would answer on vaccines.
Greater. And they'll
Right.
say, hey, it's cool, and then write it like a professor.
Well, first of all, congratulations for entering the ChatGPT world. I would suggest that every instructor in this country who is teaching anywhere from kindergarten to college needs to log on to ChatGPT and understand what we're facing. You were, yeah, please.
Does ChatGPT publish an algorithm, or is that their secret sauce?
Yeah, that's a good question. They do have publications. I find them very difficult to read. In these neural networks, a lot of the devil is in the details, and they omit that. So it is possible. I mean, Google did Bard, and Baidu and other companies have their own. So it is possible, but again, they've not published in any detail how they're doing it.
So if I understand correctly, when you talk about the bias of ChatGPT or generative AI, it uses as its source everything on the internet. And as you pointed out, almost all information historically known to humanity, right?
Mhm.
So it really represents the best and worst of us. And so the biases really represent the historical bias of humanity. And we may see it differently today as they would have seen it 500 years ago, but it's kind of an amalgamation of the bias that humanity has had. And I would suggest that that last question is, will AI destroy humanity? I think the question is, will AI destroy humanity before we destroy ourselves?
Well, that's a valid point. By the way, one thing Jeffrey Hinton said is that maybe miraculously we've had nuclear weapons for 70 years, and so far, knock on wood, we haven't used them. On the other hand, having sort of briefly been in that business, I would say it's a whole lot easier to regulate and understand and proliferation and detect it and so forth than it is to do this. You make an interesting point that opinions evolve over time. I think that's one takeaway, that an assertion that might have been widely accepted and perhaps viewed as unbiased a few years ago, maybe a lot of our political discourses like that, could be viewed as biased now. So how can AI figure that out? That's an outstanding question, and I don't think there's a simple answer other than early on in this very sophisticated network, it tries to isolate sort of what the topic and sort of the temporal context is. And then, which by the way, could be difficult to discern from your query. And then remember, crudely, I point out very quickly that the output is literally what you see coming on the screen, word after word after word. And it has modulated that word model to take into account the context of that. So back to your very good question, the answer could be that early on it's detected context that directs it to a different part of content that makes it relevant to today as opposed to relevant to 50 years ago. By the way, one point that's important that I haven't mentioned, ChatGPT cut off training in November of 2021. So it knows very, very little about what has happened since then. A perfect example is go ask it, when did the Ukraine war start? It says, no problem, 2014, because it doesn't know about the current conflict, okay? By the way, that's probably every time I say something like that, I go to GPT-4, and it turns out that they're way ahead of me and they fixed it. But it's a valid point, and again, I don't have a very precise technical answer to that. Please.
I had a question on what is the fundamental difference between the AI algorithms that preceded this and what happened in the last 6 months?
Yeah.
Like, is it a technical difference in the algorithm itself, with the clusters and stuff, or is it really just the back-end infrastructure? Like, we just invested way more money than we had to achieve this level.
I think there are three components of that. Number one is the algorithms are much more sophisticated. They can do things to generate images as opposed to, here's the sort of example that existed before generative AI, is what's called image classification. So image classification, a nice example is images of melanoma, skin cancer. There are now algorithms that will classify those at precision that is comparable to the best dermatologists or whatever. That is using a subset of that technology, deep learning, but again, it's not generating that image. It has a very complex representation of that image, and in that complex representation, it can deduce the important differentiators of whether or not it's a positive, it is melanoma, or it's negative. Now what has happened is that we've gone much further in the sense that we take that same representation of that image, but now we can go in and perturb it and learn it and use it to generate other images. So it's a combination of the algorithms, and then to your point, the point I've made several times, the compute power. In my day, we used to measure the time it took to solve an algorithm like in hours of CPU time, compute time. Now we talk about it in terms of megawatts. The amount of energy, of power that it takes to run these computers. And they are, by the way, comparable, I remember this having been in nuclear engineering multiple decades ago, they're comparable to the output of a nuclear power plant. It takes the output of a nuclear power plant to train one of these things. So it's the compute power. So Jeffrey Hinton had a great idea in 1986, so that was the algorithm piece, but he didn't have the compute power to implement it, and he sure didn't have the data. So by the way, in the old days, what they would do is they had symbolic logic. By the way, here is my first interaction with AI that So when I was an undergrad at Stanford, there was a guy named John McCarthy. He was, well, I guess Jeffrey Hinton is a grandfather. This guy was the great grandfather of AI. So he had a bunch of smart grad students in computer science. They had this great idea. They're going to build a chatbot and put it in the undergrad library. So this chatbot didn't look exactly like this. It was one of those ancient teletypes that you haven't seen in multiple decades. So I was enamored by this thing. It was my first experience in AI. So basically, when I got bored studying, I'd go down and type in a question like, well, does the sun rise in the east or the west? I mean, it had a pre-canned set of responses, and would give me a random response. And my friends and I would just laugh over this. But the only reason I tell you that is not that John McCarthy didn't know what he was doing. He just had his hands tied behind his back because he's trying to encode sunrise in east, sunset in west. And by the way, about 100 billion other facts, and then be able to query this in real time. Well, that's not a very efficient way to do AI. So the compute part of it, the fact that we got away from sort of encoding human knowledge in a data structure, a knowledge graph as it's been known, to just going out there and finding the stuff that humans have written. That's what's done it. So algorithms, compute power, and data.
Just like Nobel Prize, basically won that algorithm part. There's like a Nobel Prize for what happened that ChatGPT and what Bard is now trying to replicate. So that's what I'm trying to replicate. The algorithm still like deep learning that existed, until like 1906.
Right.
So maybe we just had now enough data to keep out that, or did something fundamentally shift in the algorithm itself?
Both. Like I say, I think it moved along 3 dimensions, all in a very optimal way. Other questions?
What companies and countries are the leaders in AI?
Yeah. So ChatGPT has taken a large investment from Microsoft. So Microsoft is now implementing ChatGPT through their browser, which is Edge, and through their search engine, which is Bing. So they, I won't say own ChatGPT, that's not true, but they're heavy investor. Bard and Google has it. Who's leading it right now? Without having any sort of definitive metric to measure it, I would certainly suggest that the United States is. The reason I think about it is because China has an enormous investment in AI, and they have enormous companies, Baidu and several others, who also have large language models. Okay, so now, when I tell you all the scary things about AI and what it can do, and now when you realize that, arguably our major adversary has access to those capabilities. And by the way, I'm not thinking that they've had a strong discussion in China about regulating this stuff. Okay, so I think it is a major concern. So those are the companies in the U.S. continue to grow, and I think companies in China, and we probably have relatively little understanding about what they're really doing with it. And I think we should be very concerned about, just like we worried back in the Soviet Union in the 60s. I mean, how do you guys stop nuclear weapons from being launched at us? Well, we got the system. Well, we don't, maybe roughly understood what the Soviet Union was doing. I don't think we have much understanding what China is doing around AI.
So I was wondering, in terms of you recommended possibly compiling future list of ethical questions.
Right.
How would you who would determine that? Because I feel like if you every single person has different sets of ethics and morals and stuff. Like I don't know, I would struggle to define like a definitive, and I guess it's more of a philosophy question, definitive answer. And on that aspect, OpenAI, they usually publish the transform things and stuff like open source, but now with investments and stuff,
By the way, their API is open. They have, but their code is that they have not open sourced their entire code block. Maybe, yeah, they've open sourced the stuff that's no longer relevant, as most companies do.
Do you think? I mean, on a system, Congress kind of model like person or like at least they.
I'm sorry, who is? Yeah.
He obviously wants to be involved.
Well, I thought you were going to ask me, how are you going about generating these trillion queries to assess whether or not the system is ethical? So the simple initial not too bright answer is no problem. We know about AI. Let's just have AI do it. Okay. Which, by the way, is a reasonable answer to almost any other question. Anytime you involve a trillion, probably, AI's in there someplace. That may not end well, as our lawyer friend in New York found out. I don't know is a simple answer. I think what you would, I'm guessing what you would have to do is start from scratch and build a query generator. By the way, it sounds like you maybe know something about software engineering. You know how software engineering is tested. You have, a bunch of either small tasks or big tasks, and every time you change the code, you put those in, make sure they work. So that's kind of the thinking that I have here. And those humans, and from experience, have curated that example to a set of, test examples and so forth. I think you could, if I think about it on the spot, I think you could design an algorithm that would do that. And the key point would be to partition that algorithm from the other side of the fence, much as you do on Wall Street, partition that from the people who could, from the AI developers, so that the people who are trying to determine the queries that will help determine the ethical behavior of this AI machine are doing so without understanding how the AI box works. And similarly, the AI people don't understand how these have been generated. Because I don't think you're going to have a human write them down. You're going to have to do this in a way that is algorithmically driven, but driven in a way such that it's not obvious to the AI algorithm. Hey, sorry, I think maybe you had the second part of the question. Was that?
I guess, yeah. I mean, the only part of the second part was like who would sort of lead that.
Oh, you mentioned Sam. Listen, I think the last thing Sam Altman wants to do is worry about regulating the stuff. I think he wants to go home and create more technology. I think you will have to have a committee of the leading AI scientists around the world. And this is a totally non-trivial effort. And because it's non-trivial and because it's impactful, it has to start right now. Any other questions? Okay.
So I just want to say, I watched TV on Sunday morning.
Oh.
Yeah, and they talked about the ethics on one end, and I'm sure I speak loud enough, and the military. Like if you're creating AI for the military, well, you don't necessarily, like you said, it's going to go for what it wants, which may not be good in our minds. So that was a little scary to hear.
The other point, the point you were going to make, which I didn't mention, he talked about AI in the military in terms of robotics, and that we are not going to send, in 100 years from now, we're going to be sending robots to fight on battlefields, not humans. Now, he raised the point that, I wouldn't immediately think about, is that this lowers the bar, so to speak. If a president of any country only needs to commit something that rolls off an assembly line to send off to fight a war as opposed to a human, that completely changes, the philosophical and ethical discussion among the humans as to how this is going to happen. I think Jeffrey's exactly right about that. Once again, that expands, and that's goes beyond sort of the ethics of AI and in terms of, how do we intersect and change how will this change policy that will enable policies that are arguably unethical and for that matter dangerous, and for that matter could destroy humanity. So I thought that was a great point that you brought up.
And then there's drones.
Well, we already have those. We'll just make them smarter.
Okay, I think that's it for now.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.